In November 1980, Lake Peigneur was a quiet freshwater body in southern Louisiana. In most places, the water was only about 10 feet deep. But 1,000 feet below that muddy lakebed, 55 men were carving massive corridors through solid crystal. This was the Diamond Crystal Salt Mine. This cross-section shows exactly why they were down there. The lake sits on an ancient salt dome. As these giant columns of salt push upward, they create faults, perfect traps for petroleum. That's why up on the surface, a Texaco crew operated an oil drilling rig. Deep below, the miners removed salt from the core of the dome, while drillers targeted oil around the outer edges. Between them was a layer of solid rock, a buffer zone keeping the heavy lake safely away from the cavernous mine. Under the ground, that safety margin relied entirely on maps and land surveys. The barrier between the two operations was invisible to the people working there, making the entire site vulnerable to a data error. Texaco's goal was simple: place their rig on the water and drill a well that safely bypasses the outer perimeter of the active salt line. But the engineers positioning the rig misread their maps. They mistook the coordinate system. The map was drawn using the Universal Transverse Mercar, or UTM, projection, a specific mathematical way to flatten the globe onto paper. The crew, however, believed they were looking at a standard Mercer projection. This top-down map shows the result of confusing the two mathematical projection systems. Inputting the exact same latitude and longitude into two different projection systems gives two entirely different physical locations. The calculation error shifted the target away from the safe outer edge, dropping it directly over the mine shaft. At 600 hours on November 20th, the drill bit tracked straight down, reaching 1,228 feet and hit solid salt. Up on the rig, the crew expected to hit oil, not crystal. The 14-inch bit seized up and jammed tight. As the crew tried to free the assembly, they heard loud popping sounds coming from below. The entire drilling platform began to tilt. Recognizing the danger, the crew abandoned the 150-foot rig moments before it slid sideways and vanished beneath the shallow water. An invisible mathematical discrepancy had guided heavy machinery right through the one layer of rock keeping the lake out of the mine. The puncture was initially only 14 inches wide, about the size of a dinner plate, but above that plate sat 12 billion gallons of water. This fluid dynamic model shows the specific physics of the collapse. The walls and thick support pillars holding up the ceiling are water-soluble salt. High-pressure fresh water pouring into the cavern rapidly dissolves the structure, keeping the mine intact. Every gallon of water that enters carries a little bit of the wall away with it. The wider the breach becomes, the more water it takes in, melting away more, or salt. The failure fuels itself. Up on the surface, the water around the sunken rig began to rotate. It tightened into a churning vortex, growing into a 4-mile-wide whirlpool. The suction was powerful enough to pull in 11 nearby barges and a tugboat, a newly built house, and 65 acres of the surrounding botanical gardens. The dissolving bedrock below transformed the lake into an engine of consumption, dragging those 65 acres of Louisiana landscape into the mine. Meanwhile, all of that rushing water was displacing millions of cubic feet of oxygen trapped inside the deep mine. The highly compressed air was forced back up through the mine shafts, exploding out of the ground in geysers of mud and debris that shot 400 feet into the sky. This map illustrates how the emptying of the lake basin created a negative pressure zone across the regional water table. Normally, the Del Camry Canal carried water south toward the Gulf of Mexico, but as the lake plummeted, the sheer force of the vortex reversed the canal's gradient. Salt water from the Gulf of Mexico began surging 12 meters inland, flowing north to fill the void. As the ocean poured into the collapsing basin, it formed a temporary 164-foot waterfall, the largest ever recorded in the flat terrain of Louisiana. For a few hours, the Gulf of Mexico, the canal, the lake, and the salt mine all connected into one violently balancing hydraulic system, permanently rewriting the geography. Incredibly, no human lives were lost. Deep underground, a sharpered electrician heard the rushing water and triggered the evacuation alarm. All 55 miners made it safely to the surface elevators just as the water reached their knees. It took 3 days for the cavern and the lake bed to completely fill. When the pressure finally equalized, 9 of the swallowed barges popped back up to the surface, but the lake they floated on had been replaced. What was a 10-foot deep pond became a 1,300-foot deep brackish bay, a shift in scale and salinity that reset the local biology. Even today, you can see the physical scars of the collapse. This lone brick chimney rises directly out of the water, marking the exact spot where a lakeside home was dragged into the crater. Most geological transformations take millennia. This environmental transformation was absolute, instant, and irreversible. This disaster occurred while every piece of equipment was functioning perfectly and before any natural shift took place in the ground. The trigger was an invisible misinterpretation of data on a piece of paper. As human ambition taps into massive geological forces, our margin for mathematical error effectively shrinks to zero.